What should have been an ordinary evening of babysitting became the scene of tragedy. By the end of that night, Renzi would suffer injuries so severe that life support was required, and within days, he would be gone. Savannah admitted to drinking 10 mini Fireball whiskey shots that evening, claiming the night was a blur. She confessed she had lost control, but the extent of the damage was unimaginable. A life that should have been protected, nurtured, and cherished was destroyed in a matter of hours. And yet, the question that haunts every parent, investigator, and community member remains: how could someone charged with the most fundamental duty of care allow a baby to die? How could a single night spiral into such irreversible tragedy? Stay with this story because the investigation, the confessions, and the courtroom revelations reveal not just a horrific crime, but the dark consequences of impaired judgment and unchecked neglect. Before that night, Savannah Miller's life seemed ordinary, but beneath the surface, trouble was already simmering. She was 31, living in Reed City, Michigan, in an apartment she shared with her girlfriend. Friends described her as friendly, outgoing, and at times responsible, the kind of person you might trust with a child's care. Yet Savannah struggled with alcohol, and though she had recently tried to stay sober, old habits lingered, waiting to resurface at the worst possible moment. Renzi McCall, the infant she was babysitting, was 4 months old, small, fragile, and entirely dependent on adults for her safety. Renzi's days were filled with the routines of an ordinary baby: feedings, naps, soft cries that demanded attention, and the comforting warmth of caregivers. Her mother trusted Savannah with these routines, believing her to be capable of protecting and nurturing the baby. Life in Reed City seemed calm, but inside one apartment, danger quietly brewed. The apartment complex was modest, the streets lined with small houses, and neighbors went about their evenings unaware that something terrible was about to unfold. Outside, the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of televisions, and the occasional dog bark created an ordinary suburban soundtrack, one that would soon be shattered. That evening, Savannah prepared to care for Renzi as she had done before, but alcohol was already poised to interfere. The ordinary rhythms of feeding, rocking, and comforting were about to collide with chaos fueled by neglect and intoxication. Every small decision, lifting the baby, changing her diaper, soothing her cries, carried unseen risk, a fragility that would prove catastrophic. Subtle warnings were already present. Savannah admitted she would drink despite attempts at sobriety, and minor lapses in judgment had been reported before. The warning signs were there, small, almost invisible, but nobody anticipated the severity of the night that lay ahead. Nothing could have prepared anyone, mother, neighbors, or baby, for the horror that night would bring. The trust placed in Savannah, the ordinary security of that apartment, and the rhythms of everyday care would all collapse within hours. Beneath the ordinary life, a storm was quietly gathering, and its consequences would be irreversible. Renzi's innocence, her tiny routines, and the fragile comfort of her world contrasted starkly with the danger she would soon face. And Savannah, sitting in that apartment, drinking and claiming a blurry night, was unknowingly setting the stage for tragedy. Every ordinary moment became a prelude to disaster, every choice amplified by alcohol and impaired judgment. By the end of the night, the fragile balance of life, care, and safety in that apartment would be gone forever. And for those who had trusted Savannah, the mother, the neighbors, the community, the ordinary, would be replaced by shock, grief, and disbelief. The evening of July 21, 2024, began like any other night in Savannah Miller's Reed City apartment ordinary, mundane, unremarkable. Savannah was tasked with babysitting her girlfriend's 4-month-old baby, Renzi McCall, a tiny, fragile infant entirely dependent on adult care. What should have been an evening of feeding, rocking, and soothing quickly became a night no one could have predicted. Savannah had admitted to drinking 10 mini Fireball whiskey shots earlier that evening. She claimed the night was a blur, that she lost track of time, and that she did not intend harm. But what unfolded in those hours was catastrophic. Renzi began showing signs of distress. Small bruises, initially dismissed, multiplied as the night progressed. By the time the infant was found to have swelling and major injury to her right eye, the danger was undeniable. Savannah claimed that some injuries were accidental. The baby had allegedly fallen from the bed or the kitchen counter, or struck a sharp edge. Investigators would later determine that these explanations did not align with the severity or pattern of injuries. Neighbors reported hearing unusual sounds that night: soft cries, occasional thuds, and moments of silence that were unsettling for the otherwise quiet apartment building. The ambient hum of the town, distant traffic, murmurs of televisions, barking dogs masked the growing horror inside the apartment. July 25, Renzi was hospitalized at Helen DeVos Children's Hospital. Doctors found bruises across the body, swelling in the brain, and severe trauma to the right eye. Despite intensive care, the infant's condition worsened. Life support was required, but it could not undo the injuries inflicted hours earlier. Savannah's confession came during interviews with law enforcement. She admitted to drinking heavily that evening, claiming the night had become very blurry. She described holding the baby, changing diapers, and attempting to soothe cries. Alcohol impaired her judgment, and the infant suffered repeated trauma. Every ordinary task, feeding, rocking, comforting, became a risk, amplified by her intoxication and negligence. Investigators painstakingly reconstructed the timeline. They documented the injuries, correlated Savannah's movements with hospital records, and matched her statements to physical evidence. Micro-tension arose in every detail. The more officers pieced together the timeline, the clearer it became that Renzi's injuries were not accidental but consistent with abuse. The community was stunned. How could someone entrusted with a baby's care inflict such harm? How could alcohol, impaired judgment, and brief lapses result in death? And how had the ordinary night, one that began with routines and trust, spiraled into irreversible tragedy? By the time Savannah was arrested and charged, the picture was clear. Renzi McCall had died as a direct result of abuse, compounded by Savannah's intoxication. The ordinary apartment, once a safe place for a child, had become a crime scene. The fragile balance of care and trust had collapsed in a matter of hours. How did Savannah's actions, combined with alcohol, result in a tragedy that would shock the community and lead to murder charges? How did investigators document the abuse and distinguish between negligence and intentional harm? When police first arrived at the West Franklin Avenue apartment in Reed City, Michigan on the morning of July 25, 2024, they were met with a scene no caregiver should ever witness. Inside, a 4-month-old infant lay unresponsive in her pack-and-play, her tiny body marked with bruises over the head, face, stomach, and hip, suffering from severe brain swelling and trauma. The baby was Renzi McCall, and officers immediately called 911 as they lifted her into emergency care. She was rushed to Helen DeVos Children's Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize her, but the injuries were catastrophic. Despite everything the medical team could do, Renzi was taken off life support just days later. Investigators began their work meticulously. Court documents obtained later revealed that when law enforcement first spoke with Savannah Miller, she admitted that she had been intoxicated while watching the child. She told detectives she had been sober for months, but that she consumed a package of 10 Fireball whiskey mini-shooters that night. At first, Miller tried to offer explanations for Renzie's injuries, telling officers the baby had fallen from a bed, tumbled off a kitchen counter, or struck her head on a sharp edge in the hallway. But as forensic evidence and medical records were reviewed, investigators found those accounts inconsistent with the severity and pattern of trauma discovered on Renzie's body. Forensic teams documented every bruise, every pattern of injury, and every sign of swelling. Physicians explained that the injuries were not consistent with a single accidental fall, but indicative of multiple blows or impacts severe enough to cause widespread contusions and neurological damage. Equally troubling were the circumstances surrounding Miller's behavior that night. Court records show that when Renzie's mother, Amber McCall, returned home shortly after 1:40 a.m., she tried repeatedly to reach Miller by phone and text with no response. When she and a coworker finally managed to wake Miller and enter the apartment, they found her passed out on the bed, while Renzie lay unresponsive. Detectives noted additional red flags during their investigation. Miller acknowledged she was aware she had been drinking that night, that her memory was blurry, that she was the sole caregiver at the time, and that she fully accepted responsibility for presence and decisions that evening. Her own admission that she chose to consume alcohol while entrusted with the life of an infant became a critical focus of the investigation. With the combination of her statements, Renzie's extensive injuries, and the medical timeline, prosecutors moved to upgrade the charges. Originally accused of child abuse, Miller was subsequently charged with murder, including second-degree murder and felony murder charges, along with both first- and second-degree child abuse counts. Also interviewed family members, neighbors, and friends for context. They gathered phone records to map Miller's lack of responsiveness, and they documented the timeline from Renzie's hospitalization to the point Miller was taken into custody. Each interview and piece of evidence added weight to the case that this was not a tragedy of misfortune, but one of negligence and preventable harm. By the time the investigation concluded its initial phase, the scope of the abuse was clear. It was no longer a simple accident story. The pattern of injuries and Miller's own admissions tied her actions directly to the fatal outcome. The phone calls, the unanswered texts, and the delayed emergency response became part of the narrative prosecutors would carry into court. The investigation demonstrated how crucial it is to scrutinize every detail from medical findings to personal admissions when a child's life is at stake. In court, those findings would form the foundation of the prosecution's argument that Savannah Miller's intoxication and choices were not merely reckless but fatal. When the investigation into little Renzie's death moved into the courtroom, it did so with a level of gravity that reflected the horror of what had happened inside that Reed City apartment. Prosecutors presented medical findings and witness testimony with stark clarity. The infant's widespread bruising and severe brain swelling were not consistent with accidental falls as Miller had claimed. Instead, they painted a picture of repeated trauma inflicted while the baby was under her care. Court documents introduced evidence that Miller had admitted to consuming a package of 10 Fireball whiskey mini-shooters before and during her babysitting duties. Despite professing recent sobriety, she told detectives the entire night was very blurry, and that she was the sole person responsible for the baby's well-being at the time of the injuries. Her initial explanations that Renzi fell from a bed or a kitchen counter or hit a sharp edge while being carried began to unravel as medical experts testified in court. Physicians explained that the combination of bruises, orbital injury to the eye, and the pattern of trauma to the head and body could not be caused by a single accidental impact. Rather, the injuries indicated multiple episodes of force unlikely to coincide with normal caregiving errors. The courtroom shifted when prosecutors emphasized the contrast between Savannah's statements and the medical reality. The blur she described was juxtaposed with unambiguous clinical findings. Renzi's brain swelling was severe, the result of blunt force trauma, and the bruising consistent with repeated impact. Jurors heard testimony about how fragile an infant's skull is, how even minor falls can be lethal, and how the patterns seen in Renzi's injuries suggested more than a simple slip or tumble. Perhaps the most dramatic twist in the courtroom came with the plea negotiations. Facing overwhelming evidence, Miller ultimately pleaded no contest to second-degree murder and second-degree child abuse, part of a plea deal in which other charges, including first-degree child abuse and felony murder, were dropped. The judge set a sentencing hearing for March 21, 2025, where the repercussions of her actions would finally be addressed formally. Families and community members who had watched the case unfold listened as the remaining charges were resolved, their grief intertwined with frustration at the slow arc of justice. This twist that the legal system would not only confirm that Renzi's death was a direct result of Miller's impaired judgment and abuse, but that Miller would enter a plea rather than go through a full trial reframed the story for everyone watching. What began as conflicting accounts of accidental injury became an admission, by way of plea, that responsibility could not be denied. The plea deal ensured that Miller would be held accountable, but it also sparked debate in the community about whether the legal consequences matched the magnitude of the crime. Some argued that the loss of other charges softened the legal blow. Others felt the plea spared the family the trauma of a drawn-out trial. In that courtroom, long after the tears and the blurs of memory, the truth was laid bare. Renzi's injuries were no accident, and Savannah Miller's choices that night, fueled by alcohol, clouded by impaired judgment, had led to the most tragic outcome imaginable. To understand what happened the night Renzi McCall died, we must look at hospital reports and into the psychology of the woman who was supposed to protect her. Savannah Miller was entrusted with a 4-month-old baby, a role that demands vigilance, patience, and responsibility. Instead, what unfolded was a tragedy marked by impaired judgment, denial, and dangerous choices. Miller had a history with alcohol. Although she told investigators she had been sober for 3 to 4 months before that night, she ordered and consumed 10 mini Fireball whiskey shooters while the baby was in her care. Court testimony later revealed that because she had not drank in months, her tolerance was low, meaning even a small amount had a profound impact on her cognition, balance, and impulse control. Alcohol changes the way the brain weighs risk and consequence. In someone with a struggle to remain sober, those effects are magnified. Impulsivity increases, self-monitoring decreases, and the ability to respond appropriately to stress or discomfort diminishes. In this context, a crying infant, a normal part of caregiving, can become overwhelming, not because the child is difficult, but because the caregiver's ability to respond rationally has been compromised. This isn't to excuse what happened, but to understand it. Miller's narrative of memory loss, describing the night as very blurry, aligns with the cognitive effects of acute intoxication in someone unaccustomed to regular drinking. Her attempts to explain Renzi's injuries as falls from a bed or kitchen counter reflected not just evasiveness, but the disorientation that heavy drinking produces when coupled with stress. Psychologists studying fatal child abuse and neglect note that substance use is a common risk factor, especially in caregivers already struggling with personal issues. Intoxication doesn't cause aggression, but it can lower inhibitions, reduce empathy, and erode the ability to process danger cues, especially in vulnerable infants, whose cues can be subtle and quickly escalate. In a sober caregiver, inconsolable crying or feeding difficulty might trigger help-seeking behavior. Under the influence, the same cues can go unrecognized or provoke frustration rather than care. Miller's own family history, described in media accounts as including concerns about her behavior around children and reports by relatives, suggests that the events of that night were not an isolated blip, but part of a pattern of risk factors. According to court documents, her stepsisters had previously raised alarm about her being around children because of past abusive behavior, although no formal charges were made until Renzi's death. The tragic result of this psychological cocktail, alcohol, impaired judgment, prior behavior concerns, and overwhelming responsibility, was Renzi's death. The baby's injuries were not consistent with a single fall or minor accident, but with severe trauma that could not have occurred without repeated impacts and forceful handling. Those medical findings aligned with what experts understand about non-accidental injury in infants, a pattern of trauma often linked to moments when caregivers, overwhelmed and unfit, react in ways that cause harm rather than comfort. In this light, the crime was not merely a momentary lapse. It was the tragic intersection of impaired cognition and catastrophic caregiving failure. Miller's decisions that night to drink, to falsely explain injuries, and to delay calling for help reveal a psychological profile shaped by denial, impaired self-control, and the inability to confront her own limitations. As we prepare to close this story, consider this. In many fatal child abuse cases, the true culprit isn't a single violent act. It's a series of small decisions, unchecked impulses, and moments of impaired judgment that together create irreversible catastrophe. Understanding the mind behind these choices isn't about excuse. It's about recognizing the danger signs that might prevent the next tragedy. By June 2025, the legal chapter of this tragedy had reached its most consequential moment. Savannah Miller, now 32, stood before a judge in Osceola County, Michigan, to receive her sentence for the death of 4-month-old Renzi McCall, the infant she had been entrusted to care for, and whose life she failed to protect. Miller had previously pleaded no contest to second-degree murder and second-degree child abuse in connection with Renzi's death, admitting in court documents that she had been intoxicated and that the night was very blurry. The court's decision was unequivocal. Miller was sentenced to 40 to 80 years in prison for second-degree murder, to be served concurrently with an 80 months to 10 years for child abuse. Both sentences will unfold over decades, ensuring she will spend the majority of her life behind bars. But the aftermath did not end with her incarceration. Miller later asked a judge to reconsider her sentence, arguing that scoring guidelines had been applied incorrectly in her case and that the term was excessive, a move that drew fresh attention to how the justice system weighs punishment against the severity of the crime. A resentencing hearing was scheduled in early 2026, yet the outcome remained unchanged. The same lengthy prison term was upheld. Renzi's mother, Amber McCall, spoke publicly during sentencing about the depth of her loss, describing how a life that should have been filled with milestones, first words, and family memories had instead been cut tragically short. She told the court that Miller's actions robbed her of every moment she would never share with her daughter, and that the pain of that absence would never fade. The community of Reed City and beyond grappled with the senselessness of Renzi's death and the role alcohol played in a night that began with routine caregiving and ended in irreversible tragedy. Discussions among child welfare advocates, legal experts, and local residents turned to broader questions about substance abuse, caregiver responsibility, and the warning signs that are all too often overlooked before catastrophe strikes. Now the story invites one final, haunting question for you. Could anything earlier intervention, greater awareness of alcohol risks, or more robust support systems have prevented Renzi's death? Or was this tragedy inevitable once those choices were made? If this story moved you, give it a like, share it to raise awareness, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to follow more real-life true crime cases.